everybody, and welcome to Roman Empire Matters. I'm your host, RM, and today we have with us Russ Whitfield. Russ, how are you?
Cold. It's cold in the United Kingdom at the moment. It's threatening to snow, but it's that sort of pre-snow phase where it's just flurries and it's the wind is bitter and it's not a good time to be out and about. So I'm glad to be sat in my study here with the fan heater off at the moment. I'm able to turn it on during this cast if it gets cold. It's freezing. It's absolutely freezing.
Yeah, it's not warm in New York either. It is cold here as well. And to be honest with you, I'm not enjoying the cold. However, it could be much worse. As my mother always says, it could always be worse.
Always could.
Just be grateful for, at least the sun is shining here and we are warm inside, which is wonderful. My mother's comfortable, so I'm grateful for that. And it is winter. It's January.
Mm,
It is the new year, Russ. And
mhm.
you and I have been talking about the Roman Empire for years now. And I started this channel because I wanted to focus on entertainment that was inspired by or about the Roman Empire. And there could be nothing more appropriate than what we're about to discuss today, the series that's based off of the famous book I, Claudius.
Mhm.
Russ, what was the first time that you had heard about, let's say, I, Claudius, even the book or even the television show? And what were your thoughts about it? Because you have been such a big fan of the Roman Empire. You're an author, you're a writer. You do so many things in this particular genre. When had you first heard of I, Claudius, and what did you hear about it?
Um, I remember it from when I was a kid. I remember um, the beginning titles, and it's kind of like discordant music and a snake going across, a mural or something like that. That's all. It's all I could remember about it. Can't remember a single thing. I've seen clips of it, and I know that it was basically a who's who of English or British thespians, and of course they're all so young. I mean, this was made, I think, in '73, was it? The television program, which I would have been two when it came out. So it's a long times ago when it came out. And I never watched it since. But in obviously we were going to be talking about it, so I decided that I would start going through the season, and I watched the first episode in prep for this.
Yeah, absolutely, Russ. And I had heard about it from the television show. I remember my mother watching it, and as I had said to you before, that my mother would watch this along with the Prisoners of Cell Block H, which was every woman in the United States was watching. The Prisoners is a woman's prison,
Mm.
and it was kind of like it came out 30 years before Orange is, or 40 years before Orange is the New Black.
It's
And
Australian, wasn't it? Prisoner Cell Block H.
yes, it was, and I remember, like, my mother and my aunt, like, their eyes were glued to the screen
Mm.
watching that, but also I, Claudius came on, and I believe that there might have been an adaptation of it earlier on, but this book, I really think it spurs the imagination because it is a dramatization of Claudius's life, and I just love that someone would want to go ahead and create this. There's so much information on these individuals in real life, in history, but a
Mhm.
dramatization in this manner, and even getting someone to perform a dramatization of the book, it's like a dream come true. I have not read the book, Russ. I haven't had a chance to do that, and I think I might want to listen to an audiobook one of these days. But it is Rupert Graves is the author, and it's a historical novel, and it was published in 1934. I don't really know how many books like this pertaining to the Roman Empire have been written prior to that time, but I think that the dramatization of Claudius is in particularly interesting because he had this, I guess, stammer,
Mm.
and it gets dramatized by the person who plays Claudius in the program, in this program that we're going to be talking
Derek
about.
Jacobi.
That's right. Derek Jacobi, who's an amazing actor. I've watched him in I, Claudius. I've watched him in Cadfile. That might have been one of the things I enjoyed the most. I also watched him in Last Tango in Halifax.
Mm.
So he's such an acclaimed actor. And this is
Well, of
one
course,
of,
there's his greatest work, isn't there? He was in Underworld too, as Alexander Corvinus. So like that. When you get to that stage, you've cracked it, right?
absolutely, Russ. And I think it is really interesting too, because the desire to pick a character to be the storyteller or the narrator. Why do you think Robert Graves picked Claudius of all of the people he could have picked in antiquity to do this?
Um, well, because despite I mean, are we doing spoilers?
Well,
Uh,
there spoilers because
well,
it,
yeah, I don't know, but look, yes, I guess we are because it's a matter of historical fact. Although Claudius was in the end assassinated, like many, 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 many Roman emperors. He lived a long and full life. Um, he was on the throne. He saw many, many things come and go, which is why the show actually sort of starts before he's born. So you've got this 90-minute kickoff episode that talks about everything that happens up until he's born, because he's part of the Julii dynasty, or the Julio-Claudian dynasty, as it became. So it starts off with Augustus as the first emperor of Rome. And of course, this is obviously before Claudius was around. Um, but yeah, all of that interesting stuff. You've got Claudius, obviously, with what he did. He eventually conquered, or his general Vespasian conquered Britannia, which is something Julius Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was unable to do, and it's referenced in the show. It's almost like foreshadowing. You also had Caligula during that period, so it was a really literally interesting time of Roman history. So you've got that lots happened in one man's life. Let's just put it that way, or a man's life and a half, because a lot of it takes place, or the first episode takes place before he's born. So there's a lot to cover, loads of interesting stuff in there, assassinations and weirdness and all that sort of thing. So I imagine it's quite dramatic.
Yes, and I think what's really interesting too is that the BBC decided to take this on, and this was in an era where public television really had just been created, maybe 15 or 20 years prior to that,
Mhm.
and now people had television sets, and they're in the process of being able to watch things on television that they could never watch before, and for BBC to do something like this, we're really lucky to even see something like that for what I consider such an important historical fiction. Let's say, for all practical purposes, even though some of it is dramatized, a good portion of it is based on fact. It's such a remarkable book. And as you said, it was during a time where there was so many interesting persons of antiquity that we all recognize those names. There isn't anybody who doesn't recognize the names you mentioned.
Mhm.
Um, and I think also that I'm not sure if network TV would want to do something like this. They had already been having sort of these, I guess you would say, Hollywood style movies on, if they were going to talk about times in that era of Roman antiquity. And
Mhm.
you and I talked about it, and a lot of times it would be something like Ben-Hur, or the greatest story ever told, maybe not necessarily focusing on the Romans perhaps, but it would maybe perhaps focus on other biblical characters. But I think that this particular production that the BBC decided to do was something that they did incredible amount of planning for, and decided that they were going to do it very carefully in the best way that they could. And even now, watching it, over 50 years later, or maybe, yeah, maybe not 50 years, but 40 something years after it was made, it's still an incredible show to watch. You and I were also talking about how they didn't just cast anybody in these roles. These were well seasoned, probably theater trained actors who take the stage, in a television production. However, it does feel like it could be a play, like a stage play. And I do also love that element as well. I also think I do like that they start off the story where Claudius has not been born yet, because it gives you sense of context. And also that it feels as if in the first episode, they really are holding on to what happened with Mark Anthony a lot. Um,
Hmm.
Tell me something, Russ. Why do you suppose that they keep re-referencing that? That was so important to them. And then it's ironic that in the first episode, which we haven't really started to go into yet, but we will, where some people don't feel it's that important, when clearly it's one of the most important stories ever told.
Well, because they make reference in the first in the pilot, I guess we're going to call it. They make reference to Drusus, which is Tiberius's brother, and they're both sons of the nominal. I wouldn't say villain, antagonist of the piece, Livia. But Drusus certainly wants a return to the Republic, and Julius Caesar, um, one of the reasons why he was assassinated was because he became dictator for life, and Brutus and all of that lot, they wanted a return to the Republic. Then you had this sort of period of civil war, which Caesar defeats defeats Pompey. Then he gets assassinated. Then you've got this aggravation between basically sort of two sides, and then there's an agreement essentially struck. I think it was a triumvirate at first, and then it just becomes basically Octavian, who is Caesar's adopted nephew, and Mark Antony, who is Caesar's commander and best friend. A kind of similar relationship to what you see in the show between Augustus, who was Octavian, became Augustus, and Agrippa. They were great friends. But Octavian is now heir to Caesar, but Caesar's had a son with Cleopatra called Caesarion, and obviously Antony and Cleopatra then are sort of vying to put him on the throne. And moreover, they've got the key to everything, which is Egypt, which is very, very important for supplying grain to the Romans. It was Rome's sort of breadbasket. So Octavian couldn't live with Antony having that much power, and it was silly, really, because really they were allies, and allies for many, many years. And this is like the person that Caesar chose, and then his best mate. But eventually they end up going at it. But the point why they keep referring back to it is, of course, and many Romans do want to return to a republic, but now it's officially an empire, in terms that Augustus is the emperor. Caesar was only ever dictator. People say, who's the first emperor of Rome? Everyone says Julius Caesar, but he was not emperor. Augustus, Octavian, was the first emperor of Rome.
Yes, and that's the first person that we encounter pretty much. It's a celebration that he's having, I guess, at his palace with his family, and he is the one who has brought in an orator who is going to be recounting these battles that occurred, and the stories and the legends, which is really turning into the legends. It's interesting, Russ, that at the beginning of the show, as you mentioned, Claudius hasn't been born yet, but Claudius talks about how he went to Sybil, and I'm assuming that Sybil is obviously an oracle.
Yeah, exactly. It was the Roman equivalent of the oracle of the Pythia, the oracle at Delphi.
And I love how you pretty much know what to expect from the story, because the oracle tells Claudius that he's going to be given something that everybody else desires, but he does not.
But he
And
does not. Yeah.
yeah, and of course, that is going to be being, Caesar, essentially.
Hmm.
And the other thing is that in 1900 years, he will speak clearly through his memoirs. And Russ, I just love how that's presented, obviously in the book, but also in the episode. It's absolutely wonderful just to know. And of course, there's even this kind of interpretation, although I don't know whether it's authentic to the book. But Jacobi playing Claudius says, "Are you there? Can you hear me?" And
Mm.
he's like, "Of course you can." What do you think about that? Do you think Derek Jacobi was the right choice to play Claudius?
Well, first of all, I I Claudius was written in the first person, so the conceit therein, I would guess, and I haven't read the book. Well, maybe I did, but if I have, I can't remember it. I certainly read Robert Graves's Greek Myths, but I can't remember if I read I Claudius. But I imagine it's called I, comma Claudius. So it's going to be written in the first person. So my guess is the conceit is when he's saying, "Oh, I'll bury it, and in 1900 years someone will find it." And you, Mister Reader, don't forget, it's oldie timey. It's written nearly 100 years ago now. This book, right? So the conceit is that you found the book. um, Derek Jacobi was not actually first choice to be Claudius, um, but as luck would have it, well, I think what happened was one of the actors dropped out, but the director had worked with Jacobi beforehand, and as luck would have it, again in the thing that they'd worked on, I think it was a stage play. He had to go from a young man to an old man. And the director said, "Well, what about Derek? I've seen him. He can do it." And they got him in. They gave him the interview, and then he got a call from his agent saying, "Derek, you've got it." And that's how that transpired. Um, he's a brilliant actor, and I think that's the thing about this television show. Like anybody that's watched 70s or 80s Hollywood movies that employ British thespians, well, you see them here before. I imagine before they got into Hollywood, and you've got Derek Jacobi, as we said. He reached the heady heights of Underworld and many other projects. Brian Blessed's in it. Sean Davis is in it. Um, Ian Ogilvy is in it, and this is just in the first episode. We know we've got John Hurt to come, and many, many, many more. So yeah, but they're all brilliant. And the fact that you mentioned it is very much like a stage play, and maybe that was the attraction to the BBC, in that the way that the book was written and the events that transpired, because Claudius obviously wasn't a great warrior like Caesar or Octavian, even, or even Mark Antony. He was an uber warrior. He was a guy with a stutter and a limp. And as Jacobi said, he said it's a gift as an actor. He said if you can't do anything with a stutter and a hunchback and a limp, he said you shouldn't be an actor. Like it was plenty. He had plenty to work with, plenty to work with on that. But I imagine the presentation of it for the BBC, you're kind of looking at it and you're thinking, well, yeah, okay, costumes, yeah, okay, sets, but actually we don't really have to show the gladiators or because our guys are reacting to what's going on. So I think in terms of budget, it was likely expensive because of the costumes and sets and so forth. But you were talking about Ben Hur and the robe and all that stuff. I mean, that's would be way beyond the BBC, in those days. So I imagine that's another tick in the box for I Claudius.
Absolutely, and I am glad that you mentioned that, and I even was very impressed with what they did. And plays are expensive to attend. We can go to a movie or we can watch something on television and it's relatively affordable, but plays can cost $100 to attend. They're not inexpensive necessarily, especially for actors of this level. It would be an expensive play. And it does feel like you're going to a stage play where you're watching experienced actors who do this all the time. They are classically trained actors, and they know what they're doing, and they know how to give life to these characters. And Claudius comes across for me, even before we do see him in an episode, as this very humble individual who truly does not necessarily have any great ambition other than to survive, and perhaps maybe even try and be a bit of a peacekeeper if he can. I'm not even quite sure whether he could do that, but he is put in a position, as you said, Russ, during a time that was somewhat tumultuous. I mean, I'm not quite sure whether you could call any of this time as peaceful necessarily, but I do think it is really interesting to see this portrayal of Augustus, who is, maybe the most well known ruler ever. from that period, and to see him somewhat jovial and happy, and he has just a happy life. And there's Livia, who is his wife in the first episode, and she is what I guess you would call a master manipulator, or
Hmm.
um, a person who, and as Claudius says, waits. She waits, and she gets her way. And I think that perhaps even the expressions of Sean, the actress Sean who plays Livia, is absolutely wonderful. She has this way of carrying off a sense of authority, but without necessarily declaring it. She is very much behind the scenes. Russ, do we know if this was the case? Did she have
Oh
an
yeah,
impression? Okay.
certainly. I mean, the amount of people that sort of drop down dead around her to ensure that Tiberius eventually makes it to the throne are many, many and varied. Um, I'm not sure about Drusus. I think that might have been a bit of dramatic. Like, it's been a long time since I was studying this stuff, but I remember that Drusus was kind of the guy. He was the sort of action hero, uh, the dynamic young prince that everybody kind of loved. You know, so he was the favorite, but he did die in Germania, yeah. And then Tiberius ends up on the throne, but she got her way. But Roman history was littered with stuff like that.
It certainly is. And Livia just adds so much fun and excitement to this drama.
Hmm.
Her subtle looks, and, she's very graceful in a sense, considering what she's up to, sort of a graceful poisoner, a very calculated poisoner. But Sean does such a great job of making her appear to be pretty much a perfect Roman lady,
Hmm.
and kind of this example that everybody would want to be like. However, I often wonder sometimes, in the first episode, as you said, Drusus, unfortunately, who's her son, right?
Hmm.
Russ, he goes out into the field. So when I say in the field, I mean to battle, and he gets injured. And I had some questions about that, but before we get to that, it starts off with this opening scene, as I said, with Augustus, who's so happy. I mean, he is just jovial, like almost Santa Claus, like. Russ, this is like, he's almost like the ghost of Christmas present.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, he has this charisma and what is it called? Chemistry with people, and he's almost looking on the bright side of things.
It's an
It's
odd choice. It's an odd choice because Augustus was known as been a bit, or Octavian was known as been a bit sickly and a bit, a bit skinny. Um, Indeed, and I can't think of his name now. The actor that plays Tiberius in this will be a much more of an Augustus type,
Mhm.
because Augustus was known for being quite a Puritan, and he wanted to return to very, very conservative ways. He was very critical of the rambunctiousness and the goings on and the orgies and the sex and all of this sort of business. And he very much wanted Romans to marry, and family values and all that sort of thing. And in fact, I believe he brought in a law, sort of forcing people to get married and all the rest of it. He was very unlike Brian Blessed. Um, but I suppose in the way that they told the story, and again, I can't remember from the book, even if I read the book, um, but if he had have been true to character uh, as Augustus, he would have been quite similar to Tiberius, and therefore you needed a contrast. But you can't not love Brian Blessed, and do we really know? He might have been like this for all we know. We have accounts written, but like any other account that's written at the time, you have to realize that these most of these people are writing with an agenda, be it pro Augustus or anti Augustus or pro Caesar or anti Caesar, and you have to sort of try and look at all the sources and try and find the truth therein. And of course, we may never know. But yeah, I mean, he's such a Brian Blessed is pretty good at. He's a brilliant actor, but he does play Brian Blessed a lot, and this is like the first exposure I guess anybody got to Brian Blessed with his big booming laugh and all the rest of it. But what I like about the performances in this is, as you said, they are theatrical, and they do it in a way in I Claudius that they wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to do it on film today, but they give you this theatrical way, so you don't have a voiceover, and again, it's like a play. So when he's talking to Agrippa, and Agrippa says he wants to leave Rome, and Agrippa being one of his best mates, but he's kind of, Agrippa's falling out of favor now in favor of Marcellus,
Marcellus, yes.
um, which is the adopted son or the nephew or something like that of Augustus, and he's clearly the favorite, and he's clearly going to replace him, and then, but he doesn't want Agrippa to leave, and Agrippa sort of turns away, and you can see sort of Brian Blessed suddenly goes from being all jovial to sort of frowning, and it's not bad acting. What it is a theatrical tick to sort of indicate that he doesn't really want to be all jovial about this. Like, he's thinking, "What are you doing? I don't know. I don't like this. I want you here, so I know what you're doing." And that's all given in these not so subtle looks. But how else are you going to, portray that? You have to remember as well, it's 50 years ago. So, the craft of acting has moved on, the craft of directing has moved on, television has moved on. But I think, as you said at the beginning, and as we've said over and over again during this discussion, if you think of this as a play, then you're not going to go far wrong, and you're not going to go far wrong with a play that's got Brian Blessed, Derek Jacobi, Sean, is it Phillips or Davis? I can't remember. It's gone out of my mind. And all of these, John Hurt, and all of these people in it. And these are the big famous names, but all of the other performances are just as good. So it's sumptuous if you like theatre, or if you want to be exposed to theatre or theatre light. It is a great way to get into it, because the language is quite contemporary, so it's easy to understand what's going on. And the way that the novel, I Claudius, and the TV show helps you out, of course, is that you've got a lot of exposition, but it's acted exposition, because it is old Claudius writing his memoirs. So he can set the scene for you. Oh, yes, Livia. She was the wife of and then she got divorced because she fell in love with him, and she was cold. And then boom, we're into a scene. But the conceit of the memoir has set it all up for you, so they don't have to spend time showing and not telling, because we've kind of been told, and it absolutely works in this particular context.
Absolutely, Russ, and it is Sean Phillips who plays
Mm.
Livia, and George Baker who plays Tiberius.
George Baker, that was it. What else was he in? Because I recognise his face from so many shows in the 70s and 80s from the United Kingdom. Obviously, I'm English, and I grew up watching him, and I know that man's face, but I can't tell you what he's been in. But
Hmm.
I guess we don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole with George Baker, but maybe I should look it up in my on Emergency Secret Service. So he was in James Bond. There you go, and he was in Heartbeat, Midsummer Murders, Randall and the Hot Cuts. So there's so many things that all of these things are sort of blasts from the pot. Minder, he was in Minder. I used to love Minder. There you go,
And
loads
that's
of
just a
stuff.
fraction, I'm sure, of his
Yeah,
IMDb's.
that's the 80s. I mean, I think that's 1986 or 87, whenever it was. Miss Marple, Screen 2, loads of stuff. And of course, we used to have a thing on BBC called Play for Today, and I'm sure he was in that as well. So loads of stuff. Goodbye,
And
Mr. Chips.
and I'm sorry for flipping it, but and certainly just like George Baker, James Faulkner, who's in later in the series along with
Mm,
John Hurt. As you said, Brian Blessed plays Augustus.
yeah.
And I was looking to see who played some of these other roles. Patrick Stewart is also in this. Uh,
Yeah,
and Fiona Walker, Sheila White,
Biggins
Kevin.
is in it as well. Christopher Biggins. He's a bit of an institution in England. Old Biggins. He was in the jungle and everything. I'm a celebrity. Get me out of here.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, all sorts of people. And I'm sure it's going to be great. I'm really excited to watch it. Like, I loved that first episode. I was, I wasn't sure. I thought we were going to kick off with something. I thought actually we were going to do the double header of the arena, the Pangria one, and Pangria Markov, and Karen McDougal and Lisa Durgan, the Playboy models that did a remake of it, which was actually pretty good. But we ended up doing I, Claudius, and I was like, oh, do I really want to watch something from the BBC 50 years ago? And I have to say, I loved it. I thought it was brilliant, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend it if you can get hold of it. I mean, it's easy to get hold of in England. You just go onto iPlayer, and there it is. It's, you know, HD, brilliant stuff. Don't know what it's like in the States, and I'm sure there are ways you can get hold of